The land doesn't lie. Men do. Earl Whitfield knew that since he was 8 years old, when his father Clarence walked him out to the west end of the property, 40 acres of scrub oak, brush, and rock, and said, "One day, this is going to feed your family." That was 1912. In 1963, those 40 acres were still full of oak trees. And in the center of it all, there was a stump. Not just any stump, a bur oak, over 6 feet wide at the base. Clarence had tried to pull it in 1938. The machine couldn't do it. Clarence died in 1941, and the stump stayed. Earl had farmed around it his whole life, planted around it, cursed it under his breath, and never pulled it. But in September of 1963, Earl needed that stump out. Not out of pride, not out of stubbornness. He needed it out because the bank was requiring it. Before this is over, I want to ask you something. Have you ever known someone who kept trying over and over, long after everyone else had accepted that it was impossible? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to read every one. The morning of September 12th, 1963 broke dry in Harper County, Oklahoma. Earl Whitfield was up before the sun. He pulled on his boots, the same pair since 1951, and walked out to the equipment shed. There it was. A 1937 Caterpillar D2 crawler. Yellow once, now rust brown and black grease. 4-cylinder engine, hand crank start. Steel tracks with 27 years of Oklahoma dust pressed into every joint. It was Clarence's machine. It was the only thing Earl had left of his father, besides the land. And that morning, Gerald Stanton and 4 other farmers were already standing along the fence line, waiting. Stanton had posted a bet at Miller's hardware store the week before, $5,000, that the old D2 couldn't pull that stump. 5 men had signed it. Earl found out that evening. He said nothing at supper. Ruth, his wife, looked at him across the table and said, "You going?" Earl picked up his coffee, nodded. "Alone?" she asked. A pause. "Dale's not coming," said Earl. Ruth closed her eyes for a moment, and she didn't say another word. The Whitfields had been on that land for 71 years. Clarence Whitfield came to Harper County from eastern Kansas in 1892. $16, 1 mule, and a will that didn't have a name for itself yet. He bought his first 120 acres from a man named Aubrey Trent. A verbal sale sealed with a handshake and 2 witnesses, and started breaking ground. By 1910, he had 280 acres, winter wheat, grain sorghum, a small herd of Hereford cattle. Then the drought years came. The Dust Bowl. Clarence lost the herd, lost a tractor, mortgaged 80 acres. But he didn't leave. Most people left. Clarence stayed. And when Earl was born, the youngest of 3 boys, Clarence told him, "This soil is your last name. Don't ever sell it." Earl never forgot that. The farm in 1963 was 240 productive acres. Winter wheat, grain sorghum, some alfalfa along the South Creek. Earl was 59, Ruth 56. Dale, their only son, was 33. Dale had come back from Korea in 1953, worked 3 years alongside Earl, then left for Oklahoma State in Stillwater. Came back in 1958 with new ideas. Anhydrous ammonia, crop rotation, soil testing. Earl listened. Sometimes. The problem between Earl and Dale wasn't really about fertilizer. It was about the machine. Dale thought the D2 was scrap. "Dad, that thing is 26 years old. The undercarriage is shot. The seals leak. We can't farm 40 acres with that machine." Earl's answer was always the same. It served me fine. Dale would press his jaw together. It's not yours, Dad. It was Grandpa's. And Grandpa's gone. That always ended it. Earl would push back from the table. Ruth would pour more coffee, and the subject wouldn't come back up for weeks. What Earl never told Dale was this. In the iron seat of the D2, on the back of the backrest, where nobody looked, Clarence had scratched a Bible verse with a finishing nail. Isaiah 41 verse 10. Asterisk, fear not, for I am with you. Asterisk. Earl had first read it when he was 12 years old, helping Clarence clean out the shed. He read it and said nothing, but he never forgot it. Every time he climbed up into that machine, he sat down on top of those words. And that was enough for him. The trouble with the bank came in May of 1963. Earl carried an operating loan with First National Bank of Anthony, $22,000. He'd been rolling it over every crop cycle for 5 years. That year, the loan officer was Horace Pruitt, a new man. 42 years old, a tie, city shoes. Pruitt reviewed Earl's file and raised an eyebrow. Mr. Whitfield, you've carried this loan for 5 years without reducing the principal. Earl looked at him. I've paid the interest. Every cent. Every year. That's correct, said Pruitt. But the bank has a new policy on agricultural loans of this age. We need verified collateral, productive land, actively farmed and documented within the total parcel. Earl waited. You have 240 acres in production. To renew this loan under current terms, we need 280. Earl let out a slow breath. 40 more acres. The only 40 acres not in production were the Westfield. Clarence's 40, the Stump. Earl drove home in his 51 pickup without saying much. Parked, sat in the cab for 10 minutes. When he came in, Ruth was in the kitchen. She looked at him, didn't speak. Neither did he. That night, after supper, he laid out the situation, number by number. $22,000, 40 acres, before October 1st. Ruth listened to all of it. Then she said, and if you can't? Earl looked at the table. Then Pruitt calls the loan, and he sells whatever needs selling. How long do we have? 3.5 months. The next morning, Earl told Dale. Dale heard it all, and his first response was, let's rent a D8, a modern dozer. We can have it done in a week. No, said Earl. Dad. No. Dale stood in the kitchen and stared at him. Then how? Earl put on his hat. With what we have. Dale knew exactly what that meant, and that's when he pulled away. Not physically. He stayed on the farm, kept working the north wheat field, kept fixing fence on the south. But he stopped talking about the west. And Earl started working alone. There was something Earl hadn't told Dale. It wasn't easy to confess, not because Earl was a dishonest man, but because it was the kind of truth a father holds back, believing he's protecting his children, when really he's just delaying the wait. Earl hadn't told Dale that the West 40 might not legally be theirs. The guilt Earl carried wasn't about not pulling the stump sooner. It was about staying silent for 8 years. Because if the bank rejected those 40 acres and called the loan and forced a sale, the first thing to go would be the Westfield, Clarence's land. And Dale would never understand why. Here's what happened. When Clarence bought those 40 acres in 1892, he did it with a handshake. Aubrey Trent sold the land verbally. 2 witnesses signed a paper that was never notarized, never filed with the county. Clarence farmed the north and south edges of those 40 acres, but the center the area around the stump was never cleared, never cultivated. Under Oklahoma's adverse possession law, valid use required continuous, visible, uninterrupted occupation of the land. If anyone could show that Clarence and then Earl had never put that center ground into actual production, they could challenge the title at the county recorder's office. Nobody had challenged it yet. But if the bank sent an inspector to verify the 40 acres, and that inspector saw that the center had never been farmed, it could be enough for Pruitt to reject the collateral. Earl had known this since 1955. He consulted a lawyer in Wichita Falls. The lawyer told him, farm it, clear it all out, plant it, get a production record on it. That consolidates the title. Earl had nodded, and he kept putting it off. 8 years. Ruth knew. Ruth had been with Earl when he went to the lawyer in '55. She'd heard everything, and she'd stayed quiet because Earl asked her to stay quiet. And she had, for 8 years, carrying that too. That's something you don't always see in a farm marriage. Not just the work, not just the debt. Also the secrets you carry together silently, year after year, because neither one of you wants the other to break before the ground does. Earl thought about it at 3 in the morning, sitting alone in the dark kitchen, hands wrapped around a coffee cup. That his son might lose his grandfather's land without ever understanding what it cost to keep it. That's what hurt. It was the 3rd week of July. Earl had been working the west field alone for 6 weeks. He'd cleared 20 acres around the perimeter, burned the dry brush, plowed what the old cultivator could reach. And every morning, before he started the D2, Earl did the same thing. He stood beside the machine, put one hand on the iron fender, closed his eyes for 30 seconds. He didn't always use words. Sometimes he just breathed. But those 30 seconds were his, between him and what he believed. One Tuesday morning, Dale saw it from across the field. He was mending fence on the far side. Saw his father standing next to the machine, one hand on the iron, eyes closed. Dale went still for a moment. Then he went back to the fence. He didn't say anything to Earl that day. But that evening, when he passed the equipment shed, he stopped, walked in, looked over the D2 with a flashlight. I don't know exactly what drew him in there, but he stayed 20 minutes. What Dale found that night, the verse scratched into the iron seat, changed something in him. Not immediately, not dramatically, but something shifted. The next morning, when Earl headed out to the west field, Dale followed, without a word, without being asked. He just grabbed a tool and started working the north edge. Earl saw him, didn't say anything. They worked in silence the whole morning. And it was the first day in months that the two of them had been in the same field. In early August, Pruitt sent a letter. 2 paragraphs, formal language, bank letterhead. It said the bank would conduct a collateral inspection on September 28th. An outside evaluator would walk the property. If the west 40 acres showed no evidence of active or imminent production by that date, the bank reserved the right to revise the terms of the loan. Earl read the letter on the porch, folded it, slipped it into his shirt pocket, and kept drinking his coffee. Stanton's bet had started at Miller's hardware store the first Friday of August. Gerald Stanton ran a 400-acre operation to the north. New equipment, a brand new 1963 John Deere 4010. He didn't have open hostility toward Earl, but there wasn't warmth between them either. Stanton had heard Earl was trying to use the D2 to clear the west field. He mentioned it to 3 men at the hardware store. They laughed. "That thing can't pull a stone off the road," said one. The problem is the stump in the center, said Stanton. That stump. Clarence tried to pull it in 38 and couldn't. You think Earl's going to get it with that old crawler? 5 men put money on it. $1,000 each. 5,000 total. The bet was written in a notebook that Miller kept behind the counter. The terms: if Earl pulled the stump before October 1st, all 5 paid. If he didn't, Earl owed the 5,000. Earl never went to sign it. Stanton came to his property and told him in person over the fence wire. You taking it, Whitfield? Earl looked at him a moment, then nodded. No witnesses? No paper? Stanton asked. My word's enough, said Earl. Dale found out that night from Ruth. He went to pieces. $5,000? Dad, we don't have $5,000. If he loses that bet, that's nearly a quarter of the loan. Ruth didn't answer. Why did he agree? Out of pride? Over that machine? Ruth looked at him. For your grandfather, she said, and left it there. Dale went to bed without supper. What Stanton didn't know, what nobody knew except Earl and Ruth, was that the bet wasn't only about pride. If Earl pulled that stump, he'd have witnesses to the act. 5 witnesses as it happened. Men who would see the broken earth, the hole, the work done. That was evidence of active possession and use. Legally, it was exactly what the lawyer had recommended in 1955. Earl had thought about that the night Stanton made the offer. And he'd said yes because of it. Not out of pride. For the land. On September 2nd, Earl told Dale the truth. All of it. The lawyer. 1955, the title. What the law required. Why the bet made legal sense, not just emotional sense. Dale listened without interrupting. When Earl finished, the silence held for almost a full minute. Why didn't you tell me before? Earl looked at his hands. Because I didn't want you carrying that. Dale nodded slowly, then said, what if the machine can't do it? Earl didn't answer right away. What if the machine can't do it, Dad? Then I sell the Alice Chalmers, said Earl. Pay the bet, and we find another way to get the West into production before the 28th. Dale ran the numbers in his head. The Alice Chalmers was the primary field tractor. Without it, the winter wheat harvest would depend on hired men. It meant risking next year's crop to save this year's land. They worked together the week of September 3rd through the 9th, getting the D2 ready. Dale replaced the engine seals that could be replaced, adjusted the track tension, greased every fitting with fresh lubricant. Earl sourced a 3/4-inch steel cable, 120 feet, from a man who worked the oil fields south of the county. The plan: run the cable around the stump, thread it through a block and tackle rig anchored to a live post oak to the north, then back to the D2. That would give the machine mechanical advantage. Not pulling the stump straight, pulling it from the correct angle, using the live oak as a fixed anchor point. It was a trick Clarence had taught Earl when Earl was 15 years old. It's not the machine that matters, Clarence had said. It's the angle. Earl explained it to Dale. Dale listened. This time, he didn't push back. On September 11th, Earl stopped by First Baptist Church in Anthony. He didn't ask the pastor to come to the field. He didn't ask for public prayer. He just told him what he was about to do and why. The pastor listened, then said, Earl, sometimes God doesn't move the mountain. He just gives you the strength to dig. Earl nodded. I know what I'm asking for. And what is that? Earl thought a moment. That the machine doesn't quit. That the cable holds. And that my son is there when it comes out. The pastor nodded. And that was that. At 5:30 in the morning on September 12th, Earl started the D2. The engine took 4 tries. spat black smoke, then found its rhythm, that heavy, steady knock Earl had known since he was 14, and steadied. Dale was beside him. He hadn't slept much. He had a flashlight and a wrench in his hand, in case something failed before they started. Ruth was at the edge of the field, holding a thermos of coffee, saying nothing. By 7 in the morning, the first neighbors had arrived. By 8, there were 12 people along the west fence line. Gerald Stanton was among them. Arms crossed, an expression that wasn't exactly cruelty. It was more the face of a man who was very certain about what he was about to see. The stump was enormous, 6 feet across at the base. The lateral roots spread 15, 20 feet in every direction. The taproot had had 70 years to push down into Oklahoma hardpan. Earl had spent 4 days in August digging around it, cutting lateral roots with an axe and a handsaw, freeing what could be freed by hand. What was left was the core, and that's what the D2 was going to have to pull. The cable was rigged. One end looped around the stump, 3 wraps secured with a load hook. The other end passed through an iron block anchored by chain to a live post oak 30 feet to the north, then back to the drawbar of the D2. 220 feet of cable, 1 pulley block, 1937 machine, and 25 years of postponed work. Earl climbed up into the D2, sat down on the iron seat. He felt the verse beneath him, like always. Set the levers, looked at Dale. Dale nodded. Earl put her in first and pushed forward. For the first 10 minutes, nothing visible happened. The tracks bit into the ground. The engine roared. The cable drew tight until it hummed like a guitar string wound past its limit. Nothing moved. Stanton said something to the men beside him. No one could hear what. Earl wasn't watching the fence. He was watching the cable. At 16 minutes, the ground beside the stump began to open. A crack, thin at first, like a sheet of paper, then wider. Dale saw it first, shouted something Earl couldn't hear over the engine. The stump itself wasn't moving yet, but under it the earth was beginning to give. It was at the 23rd minute that it happened. Not a crack, something deeper, a sound that came from the ground itself. Not from the stump, not from the cable, but from the earth, like something that had been still for decades was finally letting go. The stump tilted, 1 degree, 2, 3, and then, with a sound that every one of those 12 people along the fence would carry for the rest of their lives, the main roots gave. The ground heaved 3, 4 feet around the base of the stump. The earth split open in chunks. Dark clay mud flew to both sides. The stump came out of the ground like a molar pulled from bone. The ground shook. Ruth felt it in her feet, standing at the edge of the field. The D2 dragged the stump 15 feet before Earl released the levers and cut the engine. The silence after the engine is something you can't prepare for. That sudden quiet after 23 minutes of noise. And in that silence, what you could hear was the ground still settling, the cable going slack, and nothing else. Dale walked to the hole. For feet deep, 6 feet wide, the roots hung off the pulled stump like the arteries of something that had been alive a very long time. Dale stood there a moment, then turned toward his father. Earl was still sitting in the D2. He hadn't climbed down. Dale walked to the machine, stepped up on the side rail, looked at his father close. Earl's eyes were wet. He wasn't crying, or maybe he was. It was hard to say. Dale put his hand on his father's shoulder. Neither one said a word. Stanton left before anyone spoke to him. 3 of the other 4 men walked to the fence, looked at the hole, and walked off without a word. The fifth, a man named Bert Halsey, crossed under the wire, walked up to Earl, put out his hand. "Good work, Whitfield," he said. Earl shook it. On September 28, 1963, the bank's evaluator walked the West 40. The hole was there, the stump pulled and off to the side. 16 acres around the perimeter cleared and worked. The remaining 20 at least cleared of heavy brush. The evaluator took notes, took photographs with a Kodak Brownie. His report said the West 40 showed active preparation for cultivation, with evidence of recent removal of major obstacles. Pruitt accepted the collateral. The loan was renewed on October 3rd. $22,000, 5.5% interest, 1-year term. Earl signed. Ruth stood beside him. The $5,000 from the bet arrived in separate envelopes over the next 2 weeks. For the 5 paid without a word. Stanton took 16 days, didn't come himself, sent the money with his hired man. Earl put that money in a separate account. He didn't use it on the loan. He used it for fertilizer on the West 40 in the spring of 1964. The relationship between Earl and Dale didn't mend right away. These things don't mend right away. Dale still felt his father had taken unnecessary risks, that he'd held back information too long, that the pride of it all had nearly cost the farm. Earl never fully gave him that. It wasn't his way. But one October night, with the winter wheat in and the air smelling like wet earth, Earl said to Dale, "There are things I should have told you sooner." Dale nodded. "Yeah, I know," said Earl, "and I'm sorry." It was the most direct Earl could be. For Dale, it was enough, or at least it was enough to keep going. Ruth kept something that week. Not the money, not the bank papers. She kept a photograph someone took on September 12th. Black and white, slightly blurred. Earl still seated in the D2, Dale on the side rail beside him, the enormous hole behind them, the stump off to the right. Both of them looking north, not at the camera. Ruth put in a wood frame, hung in the kitchen. Not with the wedding photos, not with the baptism photos. She hung it alone on the wall beside the door to the equipment shed, where Earl would see it every morning on his way out. The West 40 produced grain sorghum for the first time in the summer of 1964. Not a big crop. The ground was still thin, still needed time. But it was a crop, and the bank recorded it as verified production. The title to those 40 acres, after 71 years, was finally consolidated in the county records. Earl and Ruth went to the county courthouse to watch the document get stamped. The clerk, a young man who knew nothing of the history, pressed the seal without ceremony. Earl looked at the paper and said one word, "Good," and they walked out. There are things that men like Earl Whitfield don't know how to say out loud. They don't say, "I love you" easily. They don't apologize without it costing them weeks. They can't talk about fear or shame or the nights when the debt weighs more than anything the body can carry. But they know something that very few people learn. They know that the land has memory, and they know there are ways of speaking to the land that don't require words. Drive a blade in, pull a stump, plant what should have been planted decades ago. That was the language Earl knew. And in that language, his father had said something to him in 1912. And Earl had answered in 1963, with his hands, with his father's machine, with the ground shaking beneath him. One more thing. That D2, that 1937 crawler, kept running until 1971. When it finally wouldn't start anymore, Dale wanted to sell it for scrap. Earl said no. They moved it to the back corner of the equipment shed, covered it with a tarp, and there it stayed, not as a museum piece, not as a monument, just as what it was, Clarence's machine, the one that had carried the words of the prophet Isaiah through 40 years of Oklahoma ground. Dale never mentioned selling it again. If this story made you think of someone, a father, a grandfather, a neighbor who kept going when he should have quit, I'd like you to leave that in the comments. It doesn't have to be a name. Just tell me, what was it that person refused to give up on? Those comments are the ones I read most, the ones that mean the most on this channel. And if this story reached you in any way, share it with someone you think needs to hear it. We'll see you in the next story. God bless.